Question number 4, Dr. David Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister of Finance. Why did he claim yesterday that exports as a percentage of GDP were 33% and rising, when the Honourable Stephen Joyce reportedly stated on 20th of October that there has been a lack of progress in the past 3 years?
Mr. Speaker,
Honourable Bill English.
Mr. Speaker, in regards to progress, both Mr. Joyce and I have both said this is a challenging target. I made the comment yesterday because real exports as a percentage of real GDP, which are the basis of the government's target, were 33% in 2013, up from 31.9% in 2009. The member might not like it, but this is according to the Stats New Zealand expenditure on gross GDP series. According to Stats New Zealand, real exports have eased to 32.7% of GDP in the year to March 2014, but they're still above the 31.9% level of 2009, and that's been in the face of quite challenging conditions for exporters, and they have handled it very well, showing they are becoming globally competitive and increasing their productivity.
Supplementary question, Dr. David Clark.
Why did Stephen Joyce contradict the Minister's claim that exports were 33% of GDP by saying on October 20 that exports were actually 30% of GDP?
Order, order, order. This is a point of order. Well, I hope it is. But it will, either way, it will be heard in silence. Honourable Stephen Joyce.
Mr. Speaker, I understand when this question was being verified earlier today, no reference could be made of a quotation in that regard that Dr. Clark has just suggested. For him to bring it up as a supplementary after he couldn't find any reference in trying to get his primary question through today, I think is being a bit trifling with the House.
Order, order. I appreciate the point the member's making. There's still, I believe the member's question is still in order. It's going to give some licence to the Minister as he answers it. I'll invite the member to ask his question again.
Yeah. No.
Order.
As reported.
Order. I'm inviting the member, Dr. Clark, to re-ask the question again, so for continuity purposes.
Why did Stephen Joyce contradict the Minister's claim that exports were 33% of GDP by saying on October 20 that exports were actually 30% of GDP?
Honourable Bill English.
Mr. Speaker, he didn't say that.
Point of order.
Point of order.
I seek leave to table a document where it is reported
Order.
that
I just need the document, please. And if it's a media report, it won't be.
Yes, it is.
Don't bother. Further supplementaries? Further supplementary.
I'm happy to supply it to the member. Further supplementary.
Supplementary question, Dr. David Clark.
Yep. Why did the Minister say in the Building Export Markets report that exports were 30% of GDP?
Honourable Bill English.
Mr. Speaker, as I've pointed out, the basis of the government target is real exports as a proportion of real GDP, and those are rising. I can't comment directly on the reference the member is making because I haven't seen it recently.
Tried to table. Order. Order.
I'm referring to the Minister's own report.
The Minister, member resume his seat. The level of interjection I'm receiving from this quarter here is unacceptable. I certainly don't want to ask any members to be leaving, but unless it settles down, I will be doing so. Supplementary question, Dr. David Clark.
I seek leave to table a copy of a report signed by Bill English and Stephen Joyce where both state that exports are 30% of GDP.
Order. I just need the source of the document.
It's the Building Exports Market report from MB.
On the basis that it may not be freely available, the House can determine leave sought to table this particular MB report. Is there any objection to it being tabled? There is not. It can be tabled.
It's because the Minister hasn't read it.
Order. Just ask the supplementary question.
Yep, supplementary question.
Supplementary question, Dr.
Why is the Minister attempting a statistical stitch-up by changing the measurement of exports to volume, given that he used a different value-based metric of exports in the foreword to the Building Export Markets report, when he set out the goal, and again as recently as July this year in Parliament?
Honourable Bill English.
Well, Mr Speaker, again, I can't comment on that because I haven't seen it recently, but I can say to the member, I want to thank the member for helping to clarify the basis of the government target, and I know he's disappointed that despite difficult conditions, our export sector has made considerable progress in improving its real contribution to our economy, and under current government policy we would hope to see that exports become an even larger proportion of the real economy.
Supplementary.
Supplementary question, Dr David Clark.
Well, will the Minister now concede that his new volume-based measuring statistic would place more importance on the volume of possession held by the USA Eagles in the first half of a recent test match than on the value of the All Blacks' 43 points on the scoreboard?
Well,
Honourable Bill English, in as fast as the ministerial responsibility.
Mr Speaker, where the member does have a technical point is that it's not strictly volume, it's deflated prices, which is slightly different in an economist's mind, but not that different. In either way, the deflated value of our exports as a proportion of the real economy has been growing and will continue to do so, I'd hope.
Supplementary.
Supplementary question, Dr David Clark.
Is the Minister aware that his newly adopted volume-based measure hasn't dipped to 30% at any time this century?
Mr Speaker, I didn't hear the assertion that the member made, but given his determination to try and prove that our exporters are hopeless, he's probably made some
Point of order.
Order, I can anticipate the point of order, but I will hear it.
Mr Speaker, if the Minister didn't hear the question, the right thing to do would be ask for it to be repeated rather than just make something up.
Dr David Clark to ask the question again.
Is the Minister aware that his newly adopted volume-based measure hasn't dipped to 30% at any time this century?
Honourable Bill English.
Mr Speaker, no, I wasn't aware of that. But given the member's determination to try and talk down our export sector, despite their efforts...
Order. Point of order.
I failed to see how that in any way addressed my question, which was a very straight question.
Order. A number of the questions that have been asked have been politically loaded, talking about statistical snitch-up, etc. This one is in the same vein, maybe not to the same extent, but I don't think the member can expect to ask relatively robust questions and then ask for an almost sanitised answer from the Minister. Question number 5, Right Honourable Winston Peters.
This question is to the Prime Minister.